Imagine for a second that you are sitting in a stark, overly air-conditioned room. You're applying for your absolute dream job.
Oh, the pressure.
Exactly. The salary is life-changing. The work is exactly what you want to do. You've nailed the interviews. But like right before they hand you the offer letter, HR asks you to fill out this massive 200-question personality assessment.
Right, the dreaded personality test.
Yeah. So you're clicking through the digital bubbles, and you come across a statement that says something like, I prefer working on complex puzzles alone rather than talking through simple problems with a team.
Which is such a loaded question.
It is. You pause, and you think, well, it depends on the puzzle, right? Or, it depends on the team. But there's no it depends bubble. There's only strongly agree or strongly disagree.
So you just have to pick one.
Right. So you pick one, and somewhere in a server farm, like thousands of miles away, an invisible algorithm crunches that single choice. It drops your entire complex, nuanced human personality into a rigid category and quietly flags your file as not a culture fit.
And you lose the job.
You lose the job. And the crazy part is you never even know why.
It's a chilling scenario, honestly. But, well, it is playing out thousands of times a day across the globe right now. We live in an era where the measurement of the human mind dictates the trajectory of our lives.
And that is exactly what we are tearing into today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking a massive, comprehensive journey into the science of measuring the unmeasurable. We're looking at the invisible math that judges you.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack a huge stack of research covering psychometrics, the agonizing process of test construction, the dark history of cultural bias in testing, and the current replication crisis that is forcing the scientific community to basically rethink everything they thought they knew.
Yeah, the replication crisis alone is it's fundamentally shaking the field.
Oh, absolutely. So as you listen today, whether you are prepping for a corporate assessment, applying to grad school, or just trying to understand the algorithms feeding your social media, use this conversation as a lens. We are going to decode the machinery behind the tests that shape your education, your career, and your society.
To really understand that machinery, we have to start at the foundational level, which is the field of psychometrics.
Right.
When we talk about psychometric testing, we are talking about a highly specific, standardized procedure. I mean, if we look at the APA Dictionary of Psychology, they define a psychometric test as a standardized procedure or device that measures mental functions, behavioral styles, or personality traits through controlled methods.
Okay, controlled methods being the key there.
Exactly. And Anastasi and Urbina, who wrote essentially the Bible on psychological testing, they take it a step further. They describe it as a systematic procedure for comparing the behavior of two or more people, yielding quantitative scores that represent psychological attributes.
Wait, let me stop you at the word standardized, because intuitively that seems to be the linchpin of this whole thing.
It really is.
Like if I'm just having a coffee with someone and I think, wow, this person is really extroverted, that's just an observation. It's totally subjective.
Right.
But standardizing it means we are trying to strip away the subjectivity of the observer entirely. We are putting the human mind through a systematic assembly line just to get a number out of it.
That is the goal, yeah. Standardization is the absolute bedrock of the entire enterprise. Without a standardized procedure, you don't have a measurement, you just have an opinion.
Right.
And psychometrics essentially has 5 core objectives that justify this rigorous standardization. First is measurement, which is literally trying to quantify abstract psychological constructs, like how much anxiety does this person have?
Which feels impossible to measure, but they try.
They do. Second is diagnosis. So this is identifying specific disorders or learning difficulties, like ADHD, clinical depression, or dyslexia.
Right, which carries massive medical and legal weight. I mean, if you get that diagnosis, you get accommodations, you get medication. If you don't, you're just on your own.
Exactly. The stakes are immense for the individual. The third objective is prediction. So this is estimating future performance. Think of the SAT or the GRE.
Oh, man, the anxiety of those tests.
Right. But the entire premise of those tests is that a score achieved on a random Saturday morning in high school can accurately predict a student's grade point average during their first year of college.
That's a lot of pressure to put on one morning.
It is. Fourth is classification. This is grouping individuals based on traits, like deciding who goes into a gifted and talented program or which candidate fits a specific corporate role.
Like the algorithm in our intro.
Exactly. And the fifth is research. So using these tools to validate broader psychological theories in academia.
So we are measuring, diagnosing, predicting, classifying, and researching. To do all that, the field has developed a sprawling taxonomy of different tests.
Oh, there are so many.
Just looking at the landscape, you've got intelligence tests like the Wechsler-Adult Intelligence Scale or the Stanford-Binet. These are designed to measure cognitive ability, working memory, problem-solving speed.
Right.
Then you have personality tests. The big ones are the NEO-PIR, which looks at the big 5 personality traits, or the MMPI.
Yeah, the MMPI.
Okay.
The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory is a perfect example of scale. It's used heavily in clinical and legal settings to diagnose psychopathology, and it consists of over 500 true-false questions.
500 questions.
It is literally an endurance event.
I mean, just the fatigue of taking that must affect the score.
Yeah.
Like by question 400, I'm just clicking whatever.
Which is a huge factor researchers have to account for.
Yeah. And beyond personality, you have aptitude tests, like the differential aptitude test, which predict potential in specific mechanical or linguistic domains. You have interest inventories, heavily used in high school career counseling. And then sitting in a totally different camp, you have projective tests.
Yeah, projective tests are a fascinating departure from the rigid bubble sheets. While an intelligence test gives you a puzzle with an objectively correct answer, a projective test uses ambiguous stimuli.
Like the ink blots.
Exactly. The most famous is the Rorschach ink blot test, or the T8, the thematic apperception test, where you were shown a vague illustration of people and asked to tell a story about what is happening in the picture.
The theory there being that because the image is ambiguous, whatever story you tell isn't actually about the image, right? It's a projection of your own internal unconscious motives, conflicts, and feelings.
That is the psychoanalytic theory behind it, yes. You basically project your internal reality onto the blank canvas.
I love the historical roots of all this. The impulse to do this goes way back. I mean, in 1890, Francis Galton and James McKean Cattell published a paper called Mental Tests and Measurements, which laid the groundwork for this entire field.
Yeah, that was a pivotal paper.
But Cattell made this incredibly prophetic understatement in it. He wrote that these standardized mental tests would possibly be valuable for teaching, predicting illness, or lifestyle.
Possibly valuable.
Yeah.
It's almost comical in retrospect. Today, psychometrics is a multi-billion-dollar global industry. It dictates global talent acquisition algorithms, psychiatric care infrastructure, the admissions policies of every major university.
It runs the world. But I want to pause and just challenge the underlying philosophy here. Because when we talk about the WAYS or the MMPI, we're talking about reducing the staggering complexity of a human being into a 2-digit number.
It is inherently reductive, yes.
Right. Isn't measuring something like personality or emotional intelligence,
Right.
basically like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands? You can grab at it, you can put a glass jar over it, but the very act of trapping it changes its shape.
That is a highly valid philosophical critique, and it is a tension that developmental and clinical psychologists wrestle with constantly. Psychometrics is reductionist by its very nature. It has to be.
Because you need the numbers.
Exactly. Standardizing these tools is the only known mechanism that allows clinicians to make reliable diagnoses and educators to measure the efficacy of their interventions. I mean, if we don't have a standardized reductionist box, how do we know if a new behavioral therapy for a severe learning disability is actually working?
Yeah, you need a baseline.
Right. But your catching smoke analogy perfectly highlights the controversy surrounding those projective tests you mentioned. The Rorschach ink blots try to capture the swirling smoke of human emotion, but they are notoriously controversial in modern psychology precisely because they lack that rigid standardization.
Because it's up to the person scoring it, right?
Exactly. They rely heavily on the interpretation of the test administrator. If you and I both administer a Rorschach to the exact same patient, we might walk away with 2 completely different clinical impressions.
Because the test administrator is also a human being projecting their own biases onto the patient's answers. It's like a double projection.
Precisely. It becomes very murky.
Okay, so I see the brutal necessity of the rigid standardized tests. You have to sacrifice some of that messy, poetic human nuance to get a workable, reliable metric that can operate at scale. But that brings up a massive logistical problem.
Your construction phase.
Yeah, if I want to build a test that measures a human mind, I can't just open a Word document, type out 20 questions, and publish it.
Absolutely not. The process of building a psychometric tool, what is formally known as test construction, is an agonizingly rigorous blueprinting process. It is closer to engineering than it is to writing. It all starts with item writing.
And just to clarify the terminology, When psychometricians say an item, they just mean a specific question, statement, or problem on the test.
Correct. The very first step in generating items is defining the construct boundary. What exactly are you measuring?
Right.
Are you measuring a cognitive achievement, like a student's grasp of, say, history, or their ability to solve quadratic equations? Or are you measuring an affective trait, like a person's underlying anxiety levels or their intrinsic interest in psychological research?
Let's say I've defined my construct. I want to measure, let's go with workplace resilience. I need a 20-item test to give to corporate clients. The research says I can't just write 20 items. I have to generate a massive item pool.
A very large pool, yes.
If I want a final test of 20 questions, I might need to write 60, 80, maybe even 100 items initially. Why is the attrition rate so unbelievably high? Why are we throwing away 80% of our work?
Because writing a genuinely good, statistically sound test item is remarkably difficult. Most initial drafts are fundamentally flawed.
Really? How so?
Well, for example, test developers must rigorously control the reading difficulty. If you are designing an assessment to measure the mathematical reasoning of a second grader, but your word problem is written at a 10th grade reading level, the item is destroyed.
Oh, because they can't even understand what you're asking.
Exactly. You are no longer measuring math ability, you're measuring reading comprehension. The item fails and must be discarded.
So you have to strip away any variable that isn't the specific thing you're testing. And psychometricians are terrified of falling into a few specific linguistic traps when writing these item pools. One of the biggest offenders is the double-barreled item.
Those are everywhere in bad surveys.
Yeah, this is a question that crams two or more distinct ideas into a single statement, forcing the test taker into a cognitive corner. The literature provides a fantastic, highly specific example of this trap. I vote NRM because I support universal secondary education.
Let's dissect why that statement is a structural disaster for a test developer. First, for context. The NRM, or National Resistance Movement, is a major political party in Uganda. So the statement contains two distinct clauses. I vote for this specific political party, and A, I support this specific educational policy.
Right. It's like asking an American, I vote Democrat because I love national parks, or I vote Republican because I support farm subsidies. If I'm taking this test, my brain just short circuits.
Because you can't untangle the two variables.
Exactly. What if I aggressively support universal secondary education, but I actively vote for the opposition party? Or what if I am a die-hard NRM voter, but I actually disagree with their education policy? How am I supposed to answer?
You can't. You are paralyzed by the structure of the question itself. If you select false, the researcher doesn't know which part is false. Do you hate the party or do you hate the policy?
The data point becomes entirely useless.
Yes. It introduces noise into the statistical model.
Another massive trap is the acquiescence response set. I find this one fascinating because it reveals so much about human psychology. It's the tendency for a test taker to just agree with whatever statement is put in front of them.
Oh, we see this all the time.
Why do we do this? Is it just laziness?
Laziness or cognitive fatigue certainly plays a role, especially if you are on question 400 of the MMPI.
Right. Your brain is just fried.
But it's also driven by social desirability. As social creatures, we often have an implicit desire to be agreeable, to be seen as cooperative by the authority figure administering the test. If a statement sounds vaguely positive, we just nod and click agree.
So how do you mathematically weed out the people who are just blindly nodding along?
You use mixing. You deliberately mix positively and negatively worded items that measure the exact same construct. Let's say you were measuring depression. Item 14 might be, I frequently feel energized and hopeful about the future.
Okay.
And then item 42, much later in the test, might be, I usually feel exhausted and pessimistic.
So if a test taker clicks strongly agree to being energized and hopeful, but also clicks strongly agree to being exhausted and pessimistic, the system catches them.
Precisely. The statistical software flags that participant's entire protocol. The developer knows the respondent is either entirely disengaged, rushing, or falling prey to the acquiescence bias. Their data is compromised and will likely be excluded from the final analysis.
That is so clever. Now, most of us picture test items as multiple-choice bubbles or true-false checkboxes. But the psychological literature details some wildly inventive formats, particularly something called checklists and Q-sorts, which are used heavily in complex personality measurement.
Q-sort methodology is brilliant. It takes abstract psychological sorting and turns it into a physical, tactile process.
Let's walk through how this actually feels for a participant. Imagine you walk into a researcher's office. They hand you a stack of 100 physical index cards. Each card has a single statement about a personality characteristic.
Okay, setting the scene.
The example given in the methodology texts is evaluating a hypothetical person named Castro. So you look at the first card and it just says, is a dependable person. Card 2 says, is a talkative individual. Card 3 behaves in a sympathetic or considerate manner.
The critical difference here is that you don't just check yes or no on a list. The researcher asks you to distribute these 100 cards into 9 distinct physical piles on a table.
9 piles.
Yes. Pile number 9 represents the traits that are the absolute best description of the person. Pile number 1 represents the traits that are the least descriptive.
So you are literally forced to rank 100 traits on a physical spectrum. But you can't just put all the good traits in pile 9, right?
No, you can't.
The rules of a Q sort dictate how many cards can go in each pile. You are forced to make agonizing choices like, is he more talkative or is he more sympathetic? I only have room for one more card in pile 8.
That forced distribution is the absolute magic of the Q sort. It forces prioritization. And mathematically, the rules are designed so that the results inevitably form a normal distribution, a bell curve.
So most of the cards clump in the middle.
Exactly. Most of the 100 cards will end up in the middle, neutral piles 4, 5, and 6. These are the traits that don't strongly define the person either way.
But the items that get pushed to the extreme margins, the handful of cards in pile 1 and pile 9, those are the defining pillars of that person's psychological makeup. As the texts say, those extreme piles speak volumes. It's such an elegant way to map a personality.
It really is. But whether you are using a sophisticated Q sort or standard multiple choice, once you have your items drafted, you still don't have a final test.
Right, because you have to see if they work.
You have to run an item analysis to see if the questions are mathematically pulling their weight. The 2 big metrics here are item difficulty and item discrimination.
Let's unpack item difficulty, because it sounds simple, like how hard is the question? But there is intense math behind it. It calculates the proportion of people who get the item correct. Interestingly, Frederick Lord, a pioneer in psychometrics, published work back in 1952 calculating the mathematically ideal difficulty values based entirely on the format of the question.
His work is foundational.
He proved that you don't actually want a question where 100% of people get it right.
Right, because if everyone gets it right, the item has 0 discriminatory power. It doesn't help you distinguish between high ability and low ability test takers. It's taking up useless space on the test.
It's just a freebie. Lord calculated that for a 5-response multiple-choice question, where you have A, B, C, D, and E, the mathematically ideal difficulty is 70, meaning you want exactly 70% of the sample to get it right and 30% to get it wrong.
Which leaves room for that discrimination.
Exactly. For a 4-response question, the ideal difficulty is 74. And for a true-false question, where someone has a 50% chance of guessing correctly just by flipping a coin, the ideal difficulty jumps to 85.
This is where test construction becomes a brutally empirical science. If a test developer writes a true-false question and finds during the pilot phase that only 60% of people are getting it right, they throw it out or rewrite it. It doesn't meet the mathematical threshold for a sound item.
Okay, so let's summarize where we are. We have carefully defined our construct. We've written 100 items, avoided the double-barreled and acquiescence traps, and mathematically whittled our pool down to the 20 most perfectly calibrated items.
We finally have a test.
We have a test. But I imagine my next massive headache is figuring out if this thing actually works in the real world. Like, if a participant takes it on a Tuesday and takes it again on a Thursday, does it give the same answer?
That brings us to the most critical evaluation phase in psychometrics. We have to inspect what the field calls the twin pillars of science: reliability and validity.
The twin pillars.
Every single psychometric test ever created rests entirely on these 2 concepts.
Let's tackle pillar number 1, reliability. Looking at the data, I'm seeing this defined as consistency and dependability.
Yes. Reliability asks a simple question. Does the instrument perform consistently? If you take a personality inventory today, and it categorizes you as highly extroverted, and you take the exact same inventory next week under the exact same conditions, it should give you the exact same result. That makes total sense. If a test yields wildly fluctuating results upon repeated administration, without any underlying change in the human taking it, the test is unreliable. It is generating random noise.
But practically speaking, how do researchers measure that mathematically? Because you can't just ask 1,000 people to take a 500-question test twice. Aside from the massive expense, they might just remember their answers from the first time, which completely skews the data.
That is the exact problem of test-retest reliability. It's too vulnerable to practice effects. So to bypass that, psychometricians developed brilliant internal consistency checks.
Internal consistency.
Yeah. These are mathematical formulas that measure reliability from a single administration of the test. One of the earliest methods is the split-half coefficient.
This one makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
You literally take the test and split it down the middle. Usually the software scores all the odd-numbered questions as one mini-test and all the even-numbered questions as a second mini-test. If a student scores in the 90th percentile on the odd questions, but drops to the 40th percentile on the even questions, the test is warring against itself. It lacks internal consistency.
It's broken. And then there are more advanced formulas. The sources highlight the Kuta-Richardson approach, specifically KR20. This formula is used specifically for dichotomous items, meaning binary choices like true-false or right-wrong, where the items have varying levels of difficulty. It evaluates all possible split-half combinations simultaneously.
Oh, wow. So it runs every combination.
It does. But the undisputed gold standard for internal consistency used in psychology today is Cronbach's alpha.
I see Cronbach's alpha referenced constantly in psychological papers. How does it actually work conceptually?
Cronbach's alpha is used when you have multiple items that use a rating scale, like a Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and they are all supposed to be measuring the exact same underlying construct.
Okay, so like a 1 to 5 scale.
Exactly. Let's say you have 10 questions measuring social anxiety. Alpha measures how closely the responses to those 10 questions correlate with one another across your entire sample of participants. It is quantified as a value between 0 and 1.
The sources state that the optimal values for Cronbach's alpha range between 0.7 and 0.9. Why is that the sweet spot?
Well, if the alpha drops below 0.7, say it's a 0.4, it means your items aren't hanging together. A participant might say they are terrified of public speaking, but perfectly fine going to a crowded party. The items aren't measuring a unified construct of social anxiety. They are measuring completely different things.
The test is unreliable.
Right.
But wait, if 0.9 is good, wouldn't 0.99 be the absolute holy grail? Doesn't that mean perfect consistency?
Let's add a caveat there. If your alpha is 0.99, psychometricians actually get very suspicious.
Really? What?
It usually means your questions are too similar. You aren't measuring a broad construct. You are just asking the exact same question 10 slightly different ways. It's entirely redundant. The 0.7 to 0.9 range ensures you have consistency, but still capture the true breadth of the construct.
Okay, so that is reliability. The internal math checks out. The test is mathematically consistent.
Yeah.
But then we have pillar number 2, validity. And intuitively, just because a test is reliable doesn't make it useful, right? The literature explicitly notes that validity is the most important criterion. Validity asks, does the test actually measure what it claims to measure?
That is the crux of it. Validity is about utility, accuracy, and truth. You can have a test with a pristine Cronbach's alpha of 0.85 that is completely fundamentally wrong about the real world.
I'm trying to think of an analogy for this. It's like having a facial recognition algorithm on your phone. You hold it up, and it unlocks the phone. You hold it up again, and it unlocks it again. It is incredibly reliable. It fires consistently every single time.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
But then you realize it's unlocking the phone for your roommate. It's unlocking for the mailman. It's perfectly reliable, but it is entirely invalid as a security device because it's not actually measuring your specific face.
That is a phenomenal analogy. A system can be mathematically reliable while being practically invalid. And in psychometrics, establishing validity is much harder than establishing reliability. Validity comes in several distinct flavors.
Let's hear them.
First is content validity. This asks, does the instrument provide adequate, comprehensive coverage of the topic?
So if I'm giving a final exam in an advanced English literature class, but the test only asks 50 questions about Shakespeare and completely ignores poetry, modern literature, and grammar, it lacks content validity. It's just a Shakespeare test masquerading as a comprehensive literature exam.
Precisely. Next, you have criterion-related validity, which connects the test to the real world. This is divided into predictive and concurrent validity. Can this test predict a future outcome?
Like the SAT.
Right. Or if an airline gives a simulator test to pilot trainees, and the people who score highest on the test end up having the fewest real-world accidents 5 years later, that test has massive predictive validity.
And concurrent validity.
Concurrent validity is whether the test correlates with an already established, trusted measure administered at the exact same time.
Makes sense. And finally, there is construct validity, which seems like the most philosophical of the bunch. Does the test accurately assess the underlying theoretical construct it intends to measure?
It's the most complex one to prove.
Because if you design a brand new test for depression, do the scores align with decades of existing theoretical propositions about how depression manifests physiologically, cognitively, and behaviorally? If your test says someone is severely depressed, but they show none of the clinically accepted symptoms of depression, your construct validity is fundamentally broken.
Let me add another vital layer to this. The human element of administration. You can have a test with perfect Cronbach's alpha and flawless construct validity. But if the measurement conditions aren't optimized and standardized, that validity evaporates instantly.
Right. If I am taking a highly complex cognitive test, and the room is 40 degrees, the lights are flickering, and the proctor is staring at me aggressively, I'm going to bomb the test.
You're going to fail.
But I didn't bomb it because I lack cognitive ability. I bombed it because I was freezing and stressed. The test is no longer measuring my intelligence, it's measuring my tolerance for a hostile environment.
Which is why standardized procedures, clear, scripted instructions, consistent environmental controls, highly trained raters are absolute non-negotiables in psychological testing.
So we have these intricate mathematical tools to ensure reliability and validity. We spent a century refining Cronbach's alpha and item discrimination.
Right.
And yet, this exact dynamic, highly reliable tests that consistently and mathematically measure the wrong thing leads us directly into one of the darkest, most persistent controversies in the entire history of science.
It really does.
The shadow of cultural bias.
It is a profound shadow. For over a century, psychologists have been chasing the holy grail of a culture-free test. And spoiler alert, they have failed.
Utterly failed.
The historical record of psychometrics is deeply fraught. From the early intelligence scales of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which were often explicitly used to justify eugenics and racist immigration policies, to the explosive societal controversies of the 1990s, like the publication of the book, The Bell Curve Intelligence Testing, has faced intense, justified scrutiny.
And the mechanism of that failure is fascinating. Historically, when test developers administered an IQ test and saw varying mean scores among different ethnic groups, Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans, Asian Americans, whites, some researchers instantly leapt to biological or inherent conclusions.
Which is catastrophic.
They looked at the data and said, Group A scores lower than Group B, therefore Group A is inherently less intelligent. They completely, almost willfully, ignored the structural, cultural biases baked into the very items on the test.
The initial realization of this eventually prompted test developers to try and fix it. They thought, okay, the bias must be language. English is a second language for many test takers, so they created nonverbal tests.
So no words at all.
Right. They removed spoken language entirely and used visual puzzles, geometric shapes, and spatial reasoning tasks. They triumphantly declared these tests culture-free.
But it didn't work. The research shows that sometimes replacing words with shapes actually made the group variability wider. It made the bias worse. Why?
Because culture is infinitely more complex than just vocabulary. Culture dictates how you approach a completely novel problem. It dictates how you view the urgency of time limits. It dictates how you relate to an authority figure in a white lab coat asking you to perform arbitrary tasks with wooden blocks.
That makes total sense.
The sources we are analyzing contrast two major historical frameworks for looking at this problem. For decades, the field operated under the traditional psychometric framework. This framework often functioned on a deeply flawed, implicit assumption that minority cognitive values should naturally align with dominant, usually white middle-class Western values.
And if they didn't?
If a test taker deviated from that dominant cognitive style, the test mathematically flagged them as deficient.
But then we get a massive paradigm shift. Heavily influenced by the civil rights movement and the advent of Black psychology in the late 60s and 70s, the scientific community began to embrace this sociocultural framework.
Thank goodness they did.
All right, this framework, championed by brilliant scholars like Asa Hilliard in his 1995 work, argued that human cognition doesn't happen in a vacuum. You cannot accurately assess someone's mind without understanding their social context, their cultural material, and frankly, their intergenerational histories of oppression and emotional persecution. You cannot use tools forged in an old exclusionary model to measure diverse modern minds.
Which brings us to the actual taxonomy of bias. When psychometricians hunt for bias today, how does it actually manifest in the data? The literature identifies three main structural categories. First is construct bias.
Okay, construct bias.
This happens when test writers attempt to measure a concept across different cultures, but the cultural definitions of that concept simply do not overlap.
I love the example often used for this regarding intelligence. In a Western industrialized context, the construct of intelligence often heavily emphasizes speed. Quick problem solving, rapid recall, finishing the test before the buzzer.
Time is money.
Exactly. But in many other cultures, say in rural parts of certain African or Asian nations, intelligence is culturally associated with careful deliberation, wisdom, respect for elders, and considering the social impact of a decision. If you use a highly timed rapid-fire test to measure intelligence across both cultures, you have massive construct bias. You are actively punishing people for being deliberate.
Exactly. The second category is method bias. This occurs when factors completely unrelated to the core test content systematically influence the administration.
So like the environment.
Right. If groups from varied nations are tested in drastically different physical settings, or if one group has taken standardized bubble sheet tests their entire lives, and another group has literally never seen a multiple-choice optical scanning sheet before, the method itself artificially depresses the score of the inexperienced group.
And the third category is item selection bias. This happens at the granular individual question level. A test might be mostly fair, but a few specific items might rely on cultural knowledge that is totally specific to the dominant group, and psychometricians have a very cool statistical weapon to hunt for this: the Mantel-Haenszel statistic.
The Mantel-Haenszel procedure is an elegant piece of statistical detective work. Let's say you have a massive pool of test data from two distinct cultural groups. You isolate two subgroups of people, one from culture A, one from culture B, who have the exact same overall ability score on the test.
So they are evenly matched.
They are mathematically matched in their overall proficiency. The software then looks at how these two equally proficient groups answered one specific item.
So if a participant from culture A and a participant from culture B both scored an 85% on the overall test, but the participant from culture B and everyone else from culture B completely bombed question number 14, the software raises a massive red flag.
Yes. It mathematically proves that question 14 is not measuring the target construct, it is measuring cultural background. The item is biased, and it must be eliminated to ensure test equity.
This all leads to a concept that fundamentally changed testing in 1989. A researcher named Samuel Messick introduced the concept of consequential validity. Up until then, test makers were mostly concerned with the math. Cronbach's alpha is good, validity checks out, ship it. Messick argued that you can't stop at the math. You have to look at the social consequences, the implicit values, and the real-world politics behind how a test is used.
Consequential validity forces the test maker to take ethical responsibility for how their tool is wielded in society. Bias isn't just an abstract mathematical error on a spreadsheet.
Right. If you ever felt completely misrepresented by a standardized test, this is the core of it. When a test is biased, it has devastating concrete consequences. Historically, in the mid-20th century, culturally biased IQ tests were routinely used in American public schools to track students.
Yes, the tracking system.
Minority students, who scored lower strictly due to construct and item bias, were systematically trapped into remedial non-academic classes. They were denied advanced coursework. They were denied the opportunity to go to college. A mathematical error on a psychometric test literally determined the economic trajectory of entire generations.
That is the ultimate cost of invalidity. Consequential validity demands that we constantly evaluate whether a test is doing social harm. To combat this today, modern test developers use extensive committee methods and native informants.
Native informants, tell me about that.
If you are translating a clinical depression inventory from English to Spanish, you don't just run it through Google Translate. You bring in a panel of bilingual, bicultural psychological experts. They evaluate whether the underlying psychological concept translates, not just the literal words. They ensure cultural equivalence before the test is ever administered.
But here is the massive realization the field eventually came to. Even with native informants, even with the Mantel-Haenszel statistic wiping out biased items, standardized quantitative tests like bubble sheets, 1 to 5 rating scales can only capture a fraction of human reality. They'd inherently strip away contextual detail.
They force you into a box.
If you only give me 5 checkboxes to choose from, my entire lived experience is violently forced into one of your 5 boxes. Numbers aren't enough to tell the whole truth. It's like measuring someone's height, but forcing them to stand in a trench just because they aren't from your neighborhood. So if standardized numbers inevitably strip away cultural context, how do researchers actually capture that lost nuance without abandoning scientific rigor entirely?
That realization birthed the era of mixed methods research. For a long, long time, the scientific community was bitterly divided into two warring camps. On one side, you had quantitative research. This is everything we've talked about so far.
Numbers.
The numbers, statistics, massive sample sizes, testing specific hypotheses with rigid instruments. It is highly reliable and highly generalizable to large populations.
But, as the sources point out, its limitations are severe. It is rigid. It is static. It suffers from what researchers call structural bias, where the rigid format of the questionnaire forces the participant to view the world entirely through the preconceived notions of the researcher who wrote the test.
Exactly. On the other side of the war, you had qualitative research. This is anthropology. This is sociology. Deep, unstructured interviews, participant observation, focus groups. It provides rich, thick, contextual descriptions of human behavior, attitudes, and motivations.
But there's a downside to that, too.
A huge one. It is incredibly time-consuming, highly subjective, and because sample sizes are usually very small, it is extremely hard to generalize the findings to a broader population.
So finally, pragmatic researchers stepped back and said, why are we fighting? We need the microscope and the telescope. You need both to know what you're looking at. Enter mixed methods research. The rationale is incredibly powerful, combining the generalizable, objective, structural power of quantitative data with the contextual, culturally rich, human detail of qualitative data.
A major architect of how we do this today is John Creswell. He outlined several specific, highly structured designs for how researchers can combine these methods effectively without compromising the integrity of either. Let's look at the primary ones.
The first one makes intuitive sense. The concurrent triangulation design, often called the convergent design, this is where you deploy both methods at the exact same time. You collect your quantitative data, say a massive 5,000-person survey on workplace burnout, and simultaneously your team is conducting deep dive qualitative interviews with 50 employees.
Right.
Then during the analysis phase, you cross-reference or triangulate the results. Do the statistical numbers confirm the emotional stories you were hearing in the interviews, or do they contradict each other?
And closely related to that is the embedded design. This is where one type of data plays a strictly supportive role within a study that is fundamentally based on the other.
Give me an example of that.
So imagine you are running a massive quantitative clinical trial for a new antidepressant. The primary data is quantitative, symptom reduction scores. But embedded within that trial, you interview a handful of participants qualitatively just to understand how the medication's side effects are impacting their daily lives. The qualitative data is embedded within a quantitative framework.
But where it gets really strategic are the sequential designs, where one method directly informs and builds the other. In an exploratory sequential design, you start with the qualitative phase.
Right, you're exploring.
Let's say you want to study a brand new phenomenon, like the psychological impact of living entirely in virtual reality. There are no existing psychometric tests for this. So you start by exploring. You interview 20 hardcore VR users. You gather their stories, you identify themes, maybe themes of digital dissociation or avatar dysphoria. Then you use those qualitative findings to write a brand new quantitative instrument, a survey, to test those specific themes on a population of 10,000 VR users.
And the reverse of that is the explanatory sequential design. You start quantitative to get the big picture. You give a mental health survey to 5,000 college students. The numbers come back, and they show a massive, unexpected spike in anxiety, specifically among second-year engineering students.
Okay.
The math shows you what is happening, but it can't tell you why. So you follow up with the qualitative phase. You pull 15 of those second-year engineering students into a room and interview them to explain the statistical anomaly.
Now, there is a very specific, fiercely guarded methodological rule mentioned in the sources regarding that exploratory sequential design. When you do the qualitative interviews first to build your brand new survey, you cannot use the exact same sample of people for the subsequent quantitative phase.
It is a cardinal sin of mixed methods.
Why? Intuitively, wouldn't you want to give the survey to the people who help you build it to see if you got it right?
No, because it introduces massive confounding factors and undue duplication. Your qualitative sample is typically very small and highly engaged with the research topic. By participating in deep interviews, you have primed them.
Ah, I see.
You have altered their perspective on the topic. If you then give them the quantitative survey, their answers will be biased by the interview process itself. To generalize to a broader population, your quantitative sample must be large, independent, and unprimed. You draw both samples from the same target population, say VR users, but the specific individuals must not overlap.
It's about maintaining the sterile environment for the quantitative math to work. Okay, so mixed methods gives us the best of both worlds. And if we zoom all the way in on that qualitative side, the sources detail a deeply fascinating specific method for analyzing human stories: narrative analysis.
Narrative analysis is one of the most beautiful qualitative methodologies because it rests on a profound psychological assumption. Human beings make sense of their chaotic lives through the stories they tell.
It's how we process reality.
Exactly. This method doesn't just treat spoken language as a vehicle for delivering facts, it treats the underlying structure of the story as an object for scientific investigation. How a person structures a narrative, what they emphasize, what they leave out, how they frame the conflict, reveals their underlying beliefs, their cultural context, and their psychological reality.
The sources detail a highly specific six-step framework for analyzing the structure of stories developed by William Libov in 1997. Libov argued that a fully formed, coherent narrative will almost always contain these six elements. I want to spend some real time on this because it changes how you listen to people talk. Let's break down a story sentence by sentence.
Let's do it.
Imagine I'm a participant in a qualitative study about urban anxiety. And I tell you this story. I was walking through downtown Chicago last winter. It was freezing, the sun was going down, and I didn't have my phone. Suddenly, this guy in a heavy coat stepped out of an alley and blocked the sidewalk. My heart just completely stopped. I thought I was about to get mugged. But he just pointed at a dropped wallet on the ground, smiled, and kept walking. I guess city living makes you assume the worst in people.
That is a perfect, fully formed Libovian narrative. Let's code it together. The first element is the abstract. This is the summary or overview at the very beginning. Often participants start with a phrase like, "Let me tell you about the time I got lost." In your story, you jump straight in, which is common in rapid conversation.
Right. My first line was, I was walking through downtown Chicago last winter.
That perfectly aligns with element two, the orientation. This is where the storyteller establishes the setting, the time, the place, and the characters. You set the scene, then you added, "It was freezing, the sun was going down, and I didn't have my phone." This deepens the orientation by establishing vulnerability.
Then we hit element three, the complicating action. This is the inciting incident, the main plot point, the conflict that drives the story forward. Suddenly, this guy in a heavy coat stepped out of an alley and blocked the sidewalk.
Now, here is the most crucial psychological element for a qualitative researcher. Element four, the evaluation. This is the storyteller's internal commentary on the meaning or emotional weight of the events. You said, "My heart just completely stopped. I thought I was about to get mugged."
So it shows what I was feeling.
Exactly. The evaluation tells the researcher why the story is being told. It reveals your internal state of terror and assumption of threat.
Then the tension breaks with element five, the resolution, the outcome of the complicating action. But he just pointed at a dropped wallet on the ground, smiled, and kept walking.
And finally, element six, the coda. The coda brings the narrative back to the present moment and offers a final reflection on the broader meaning. I guess city living makes you assume the worst in people. The coda is pure gold for a researcher studying urban anxiety. It perfectly encapsulates the psychological toll of the environment.
By systematically coding thousands of pages of interview transcripts using this exact framework, qualitative researchers can map how different demographics construct meaning out of trauma, success, or daily life. It's incredibly rigorous. We've covered test construction, cultural bias, mixed methods, narrative analysis. I mean, it seems like we have built an impenetrable fortress of scientific methodology.
It does seem that way.
But, and this is a colossal but, even when researchers use brilliant mixed methods designs, even when they calculate Cronbach's alpha flawlessly, there is an unavoidable human element at the center of the process. The scientists themselves. What happens when the intense academic pressure to publish, the pressure to secure grant funding, causes scientists to subtly or overtly cheat the math?
This brings us to a deeply unsettling reality, often referred to as the replication crisis. Over the last decade, psychology, alongside medicine and economics, has faced a massive internal reckoning. A shocking number of classic textbook psychological studies, studies that have informed public policy and clinical care for years, could not be replicated when independent groups of scientists tried to repeat the exact same experiments.
The fortress crumbled. And this lack of replicability didn't just happen by accident. It exposed the widespread systemic use of QRP's questionable research practices.
Exactly. Researchers weren't necessarily forging data out of thin air, but they were manipulating the statistical boundaries to force their data to look significant. The sources list some of the most ravaging QRPs. One is the selective deletion of outliers. A researcher runs an experiment and the data is messy. So they quietly delete the data points that ruin their beautiful trend line, claiming they were anomalies or equipment errors.
Then you have selective reporting. You run a massive study measuring the effect of a new teaching method on math, reading, science, and history scores. It fails completely in math, reading, and history. But by pure statistical chance, there's a slight bump in science.
So what do you do?
You write a glowing paper titled, "New Method Dramatically Improves Science Scores," and you bury the math, reading, and history failures in a file drawer. It's cherry-picking reality.
But perhaps the most mathematically insidious practice mentioned in the literature is arcing. Coined by Norbert Kerr in 1998, it stands for hypothesizing after the results are known.
Say more about that.
In the rigorous scientific method, you are supposed to formulate a specific hypothesis first, run the experiment, and see if the data supports it. That is the test. In arcing, a researcher gathers a massive mountain of data on 50 different variables and then just runs endless statistical correlations until they find something that connects by pure random chance.
And then,
Once they find a random correlation, they write their paper claiming they had predicted that exact relationship from the very beginning.
let me make sure I understand the absolute absurdity of Arkin. It is essentially like a guy blindfolding himself spinning around and shooting an arrow into a massive blank wooden fence.
Right.
He walks up to the fence, pulls out a paintbrush, and meticulously paints a bullseye perfectly around wherever the arrow happened to land. And then he turns to the scientific community and says, "Look what an amazing marksman I am. I hit the bullseye I was aiming for." It is fundamentally cheating the scientific process.
That metaphor captures it perfectly. The target must be painted before the arrow is fired. When you paint it afterward, you destroy the predictive validity of the scientific literature. Those random correlations are just statistical noise, which is exactly why they fail to replicate when another lab sets up the target properly and fires their own arrow.
So how is the scientific community fighting back? How do we rebuild the fortress and fix the replication crisis?
The cure is the open science movement. The sources outline clear, rigorous solutions. First, researchers must design studies with sufficient statistical power, meaning massive sample sizes that can detect true effects and drown out the noise. Second, the academic journals must commit to publishing null findings.
This is huge. If a massive, rigorous experiment shows that a popular psychological intervention has absolutely no effect, that is vital, world-changing scientific knowledge. We have to stop punishing scientists for finding out that something doesn't work.
Precisely. We have to fight the publication bias that only rewards groundbreaking discoveries. Third, researchers must now pre-register their hypotheses and describe their procedures in exhaustive detail before they collect a single point of data. You publicly declare your target before you shoot the arrow.
Exactly.
And finally, as researchers like Brandt and colleagues noted in 2014, the field must actively incentivize and publish high-quality replications of existing studies.
This ethical reckoning isn't just for the quantitative math nerds either. It extends heavily into qualitative research, especially in global research collaborations. When you are dealing with deeply personal human stories, often from marginalized cultures, the ethical challenges are profound.
Very much so. In qualitative research, instead of mathematical reliability, researchers strive for a concept defined by Lincoln and Guba called dependability. This means the entire research process must be intensely logical, traceable, and documented.
So there's a paper trail.
A massive one. Qualitative researchers maintain a rigorous audit trail, a chronological, exhaustive record of every methodological decision, every change in the interview protocol, every single iteration of how they coded the narratives. An external reviewer can walk into the lab, demand the audit trail, and verify that the researcher didn't just make up the themes to fit a catchy academic narrative.
Another qualitative ethical practice that I absolutely love is member checking. It is so respectful of the participant. After the researcher spends months analyzing the interviews and finding overarching themes, they don't just publish it. They actually take the transcripts and the polished findings back to the original participant.
That's great practice.
They sit down and ask, "Did I get this right? Is this an accurate, culturally authentic representation of your lived experience?" It ensures the researcher hasn't colonized or misrepresented the participant's truth.
It democratizes the entire data analysis process. It shifts power back to the human beings being studied. And today, all of these processes, the quantitative item analysis, the qualitative audit trails, the massive mixed methods deployments are being completely supercharged by the integration of technology.
The tech integration is staggering. For quantitative data, online survey platforms like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey allow a single researcher to deploy a deeply complex, beautifully formatted psychometric instrument to 10,000 people globally in a matter of seconds. The data feeds instantaneously into statistical software that calculates Cronbach's alpha and Mantel-Hansel statistics in real time.
And for qualitative data, researchers no longer rely on highlighters and physical index cards. They use sophisticated software like HyperQual or NVivo to manage massive walls of interview text.
Right.
You can digitally code narratives, run complex Boolean searches for intersecting themes across hundreds of transcripts, and maintain that crucial immutable audit trail entirely digitally. The scale and speed of research have fundamentally transformed.
Which is incredibly powerful, but it also acts as a massive amplifier for all the risks we've discussed today. Because if a test developer builds a flawed instrument, a test riddled with double-barreled questions, construct bias, and cultural blind spots, and then digitizes it and distributes it globally via an online platform, they are generating invalid, harmful data at an unprecedented, terrifying scale.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword. Technology allows us to measure the mind with breathtaking efficiency, but it does not absolve us of the slow, painstaking, ethical responsibility of ensuring we are measuring the right things in the right way.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We've covered a truly staggering amount of ground. We have seen that behind every seemingly simple personality quiz you take for a job, behind every medical diagnostic scale, behind every sociological statistic reported in the evening news, there is a vast, messy, brilliantly complex, and constantly evolving science.
It's a huge undertaking.
Test makers and researchers are out there every single day, wrestling with the mathematical intricacies of item difficulty, fighting to eradicate their own cultural biases, and building open science frameworks to resist the temptation of bad research, all to capture just a fleeting, accurate glimpse of human nature.
It is a monumental, almost impossible task. They are trying to build standardized boxes that can hold the infinite variety of the human mind without crushing it. And as we've explored, it requires constant, unwavering vigilance through rigorous reliability checks, deep ethical interrogations of consequential validity, and a profound respect for the human stories that numbers alone can never tell.
And so, we want to leave you, our listener, with a lingering thought. Everything we've talked about today involves tests you know you are taking. You sit down in a chair, you are handed a bubble sheet, or you log into a portal. You consent to be measured. But consider the world we live in right now. A world driven entirely by metadata and big data analytics.
The digital footprint.
Every single online click you make, every second you linger on a specific video, your watch history, your purchasing habits, the geographic tracking in your pocket, even the exact millisecond speed at which your thumbs hit the glass of your smartphone, all of it is constantly being recorded, fed into massive predictive models and categorized by invisible algorithms.
Which raises an urgent defining question for our era. Are we now living in a world of continuous 24/7 unconsenting psychometric testing?
Exactly. If our massive digital footprints are constantly being mined to measure our traits, to predict our behaviors, and to classify our personalities, usually to sell us products or to manipulate our political behavior, who is in charge of the blueprint? Who is checking the reliability, the validity, and the catastrophic cultural bias of the algorithms that are silently measuring us?
It is the ultimate terrifying evolution of Cattell's 1890 understatement. The measurement of the human mind is no longer just possibly valuable. It is the most powerful currency on the planet. It is ubiquitous.
The X-ray machine is running constantly, and we can't even see it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the metrics, keep looking for the biases, and keep questioning the muddy waters. We'll see you next time.